Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. All right, welcome to another exciting episode of The Christian Skeptic. I am joined today, again, by good friend, lead singer of the band Amberlin, and pastor Stephen Christian. Stephen, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Am I the only repeat customer that you've had? Did I set records? Has anybody else been on more than once?
I think you're the only repeat.
That's right.
Interview I've ever done. You're also the only other pastor I've ever had on the show. So, fun fact.
Ooh, fun fact. That is a fun fact.
I don't know if I can still call myself a pastor. Maybe once a pastor, always a pastor. Maybe not. I'm a heathen now. I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I really don't. I think that once a pastor, you should always act like a pastor.
But that does bring us to today's topic. A topic that you really pushed for and wanted to talk about. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah.
And that's how much should pastors be paid is the question that we will be answering together today.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my answer right away, and feel free to do the same, and then we can kind of explain those. So I think my answer to how much should a pastor be paid is that a church shouldn't want to make a pastor poor and shouldn't want to make a pastor rich. And so there isn't really an exact number in that, but I think that should be the heart behind it. And then there's probably another aspect to it where there should be a pastor's heart behind it, and that a pastor shouldn't necessarily want to keep all the money they make either, depending on their salary as well. That's not to say that pastors shouldn't want to make a lot of money. And, I think that in the society in which we live in America, in the capitalist society, you can make money on multiple streams of income. And so I think we have to add that caveat in there as well, that if a pastor wants to make a lot of money, that's not necessarily a wrong thing. It's when a pastor wants to keep a lot of money that becomes the wrong thing. So I think that's my answer kind of off the front of this question, and we can kind of go deeper into that. I'd like to divide this conversation into those two different categories, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it before we do, of churches shouldn't make a pastor poor, and so the vow of poverty mentality, and we can discuss that. And then churches shouldn't make a pastor rich, so not paying your pastor enough to buy like 3 Lamborghinis, and we can probably talk about that because there's good examples of both in our culture. But I'm curious to hear your kind of first answer to the question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little subjective as far as what is rich. My good friend, I don't know if you've heard of him, his name's Sean Kerwin. He had this podcast, and in it he said something to the effect of, life is about perspective. If you're making over $30,000, you are a part of the 99%. I mean, you are ahead of 99 percentile. You remember saying that?
Oh yeah, I remember that.
It was, yeah. So
it's 35,000. But yes,
35,000. Yes, I'll take it. So 35,000. I mean, so. Is rich 35,000? Well, yes, compared to the rest of the world, 35,000 is a lot of money. To America, no, that's not. That's almost. Well, I mean, poverty is right around 21,000, under 21,000 a year, and so it's not teetering on, but it's above. Not a lot. Probably roughly 30% above poverty rate. So, I mean, it's subjective as far as how much a pastor is, should be making. In my opinion, I feel like a pastor should make a lot of money. Now, not all pastors should make a lot of money. I think it's very subjective as far as how big is your congregation. And the reason that I say like it's almost a numbers to numbers game is because, you are overseeing a lot more people. For instance, Sean, if you owned a company, you started your own engineering firm, and you said, okay, I have our company is pulling in an 8-figure income per year, or, roughly 8 figures. We have 12,000 weekly customers. We have 147 full-time employees and 300 part-time. I would presuppose that you, as the CEO and president of your company, should be making roughly $6 million. That's, and that's awesome. Like that would be, if no one would bat an eye if your company was pulling in 8 figures and you had 147 full-time employees. Now, if you transpose that into a church, that's, let's say the budget, like they're the yearly revenue is 30 million, and you have 12 to 15,000 people coming to your church. You got 147 full-time employees, 300 part-time with teachers and some musicians. If 6 million is grotesque, that seems unreasonable. But I don't think it's crazy to pay that person $1 million. And people are going to be up in arms in that. And that's fine. I've never worked for a pastor that's made 7 figures. So this to me is me just throwing out a number that I feel is adequate. You will not find, I do not know any personally. I've worked at very, very large churches and don't even know a pastor that makes half that. So let me just throw that out there. But I do think that a workman is worth double their wage. And the reason being is that if that person was not called by God, but instead called to start an engineering firm and they're obviously a good leader, they're obviously driven, they're obviously have momentum, they're galvanizers. There's some superpower, that or super quality that is magnetic, and they know how to acquire. Their customer acquisition is on point. So if they're in the world, they're making 6 million, and this pastor is only making $1 million. I say only because I feel that they're worth that. Now, again, I don't know a church that would pay that. But to me, I never want it to be a point where let's say if I was the senior pastor, I would never want to get one of my pastors to have to choose between money or ministry. I never want them to have to get to that point. I want them to say, listen, I see what the world's offering. I see my skill set, but I also see a calling to ministry. And any other so there's a lot of sectors, even within the church, that already have this to match. For instance, right now, our church, a Grace Family Church, and many, many others, are aggressively pursuing graphic designers, creative directors, social media coordinators, and all these people are getting top dollar. They're working from home, a lot of them, the competitive pay. And so when a church needs those resources, we can't go, oh, you know what, we can only pay you $25,000 a year, $50,000 a year. They're going to go, absolutely not. I'm choosing not to go into ministry because I know I can make triple what the world is out there. So let's say hypothetically I'm a church and I go, oh, they're not fully into the ministry. They're not fully engaged in ministry. So now they are choosing to go into the world and create a superb product. But now my product is suffering because I choose not to compete salary-wise with the rest of the world. Well, so if I came to you and I said, listen, I'm starting a church and I'm going to pay my social media guy $50,000 because that's how much he can make working for, even a localized company. Let's say even 40,000 sounds reasonable to me. So 40,000 to 50,000, I want to pay him the same competitive rate, and now he's choosing ministry because I know this guy can crush it. Well, you would probably be like, that seems a little bit high, but you absolutely in 2022 need a social media director that's quality, that's going to stand out, that understands search engine optimization, who understands how to boost ads. And I don't want to train a high schooler how to do that and pay them, $10 an hour. We're going to get that type of quality. So that seems logical. But if I now transpose that and say, listen, I want to pay this campus pastor, this campus has about 1,500 to 2,000 attendees. I want to pay them $150,000 a year. Most people would be like, are you kidding? A campus pastor, $150,000 a year? That's insane. But I come to you and saying, well, do you know other companies that are bringing in 2,000 people and a revenue and building this type of program with this type of leadership and this type of oration skills? No, but he's a pastor. He should only be paid, $50,000. So why is it that with pastors, we say, oh no, there almost needs to be a vow of poverty. But I'm telling you that it takes a strong leader to run a strong campus. So I'm telling you to pay them higher so that we can keep getting congregants in and drawing them in through creative ideas, through positive delegation, through strong oration, through people skills and galvanizing and innovation. And so that leader could turn around and go to the world and make triple what you're telling me to pay them. So that's I've got many more points to discuss, but I want to stop here and allow a little. A lot
There's
to
a
dissect.
lot you said that I think we need to unpack a little bit here.
Yeah, let's go. Yep.
First thing is you referenced something Paul talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 5. You said the laborer is worthy of his wages or worthy of his reward, as some translations put it. You said double, but I'm assuming that was just a Freudian slip.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes, true.
Fair enough. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt on that one. But to that point, right, Paul says that you shouldn't muzzle an ox that treads out the
Oh, I'm
grain.
sorry.
Right?
I'm sorry. I was thinking our workman is worth double the honor. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Two verses melding into one.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And so to that point, you were throwing out some numbers, but the first thing I thought of is, well, location matters when it comes to numbers as well.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
you live, and I hope you're okay with me saying where you live.
Yeah.
You live in St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
Florida, right? That is, when you look at the scale of cost of housing, cost of living, expenses, that's one of the more expensive places in the country to live, right? I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is one of the not those areas. Cost of housing is a fraction of what it is here as opposed to there, right? And so there is this mentality, and I'll just be 100% real and honest. That's actually the language that was given to me when I was choosing to become a pastor and to leave engineering is, well, you have to choose between money and ministry or money and meaning, right? And fair enough. I don't actually know that I fault the person that gave me that language for giving me that language, because I think that there is some validity to the choice, actually. I think that choosing between ministry and money actually has some kind of biblical backing, and that a vow of poverty isn't necessarily always a bad thing when it comes to being a pastor. For context, when I was a pastor, I had a household income of $33,000 a year that year, right? And so, you said a pastor making 50. I was like, yeah, that would have been nice. But for context, location matters, right? And this might sound phenomenological to listeners, but I really do think that God was faithful to provide during that season. But nevertheless, that does bring out the question of, is the vow of poverty necessary here in America? Because we're also presupposing now a kind of cultural divide in income of pastors, right? Because if we take a pastor outside of America, the vow of poverty is real, right? And so now we have to introduce the word privilege as well when we talk about this, and just face the facts that we do live in a privileged society, right? And more on that point probably later, and to what I was getting at with a pastor shouldn't want to keep all of their income, right? And that we should recognize our privilege and use it. So probably more to that point later. But I think focusing back on the vow of poverty thing, it's a tough line to say what is poverty, right? But at the same time, you don't want to pay your pastor so little that they can't afford to live in the city that they're a pastor in, right? And so that's then back to the point of, well, you're in St. Petersburg. I mean, what's the average cost of a house there?
Oh my Lord, you don't want to know.
Ballpark.
For my wife's a real estate agent. She's standing right here. So for a 3-2 in downtown St. Pete, we're talking about 550 more, 650, 750. What are you saying? Well, just say it. Yeah, downtown St. Pete would be 650 to 750.
Seminole, you're looking at 556.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, you can't buy a house on $50,000 a year there.
No.
And so 50,000 is fine if we presuppose the pastor has no wife or children and no plans to ever have those.
Yes, exactly.
But if we assume, like Paul did, that the pastor is going to be the husband of one wife and a father to children, which is by and large the hope of all pastors, right? Then to live in a place like that, you have to make more money than just $50,000 a year. And so,
well, that's fine. I mean, I'd already, like to push back in the simple fact that, as far as I would never, as a pastor, want to put my team, especially if I believed in their leadership or their IQ or their EQ, in a position where they're looking at the outside world and saying, listen, I've got debts I need to pay off. I've got children I've got to put through school. I've got, daughters that I've got to, pay for weddings. And there was somebody at my church, and I'm not, I'll keep his name anonymous. I don't think he would mind me sharing his story. But he walked away from the ministry for about 6 years because he felt like, listen, I need to get my debts resolved and I need to set myself up for retirement. And then he came back to the church. That to me is embarrassing, because not for him, but it's just one of those things where I would hope that we could pay them and Grace pays very well, but I'm just saying, I have no qualms currently. What I'm saying is, I don't want to put high level leaders into a predicament where they're choosing the outside. Why can't we as Christians, it seems that we trail the world in so many areas. We trail it creative wise. We trail it musically. We trail it even business wise and marketing and all the way around. It feels like we're just 2 steps behind at all times. But what if we took those thinkers, those entrepreneurs, those musicians, and we added them into the church, paid them a healthy wage so that the church can flourish, the church can grow, the church can, thrive, not just survive. So I want to keep good employees, and I have a few on my staff that if they were just like, hey man, I've got another job, somebody offered me this, I would try everything I could that I would, attempt to have them on my team, like for the long duration. And I would try as best I could to make sure that money was not, a factor in that equation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the point I was getting at, is that if you keep your pastor paid just below the point to where he can afford to comfortably take care of his family, right? And you mentioned going into debt, like the fact that a church would ever let a pastor go into debt, it almost seems unbiblical the way the Bible talks about debt. And that's, totally different discussion. And I'm not Dave Ramsey, so I won't go into it. But,
right.
But the fact that, a church would ever pay a pastor so little, that they would struggle just to live and to take care of their family does seem unbiblical, because the Bible does say that he who doesn't take care of his own house first is worse than an unbeliever. So I think we're on the same page on that. So we can probably move.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No man anything but love.
Paul said that in Romans.
So I want to continue on my analogy of the company with the 8-figure of income and revenue. One thing about it is, if you start an engineering firm, Sean, with all those factors in mind, the 12,000 weekly customers, the 147 employees, blah, blah, blah. The thing about that, Sean, is if your children don't feel like continuing in your line of business, you have equity. You own 100% of that company. And so now you have an 8-figure revenue. It's coming in $30 million. Well, you and I both know if you're going to sell your company, it's about 3 to 5 times the amount of money that it's bringing in is what your company is worth. So you could turn around and sell that company right there, Sean, for $120 million when you feel like retiring. You are generationally wealthy. Like, if you set up a nice trust, your great-grandchildren are still going to be wealthy because you can set up your money that, strategic with trusts. Pastors don't have that. There is no handing off amount of money. In a lot of churches' bylaws, it will say something to the effect of, if this church fails, we sell it all and we distribute it to local churches. We don't sell it all and then give it to great-grandchildren, or we don't sell it off and make generational wealth. And so that's just another reason why I feel like pastors should get retirement funds and should be set up for the future. Not because I want to make their grandchildren wealthy. That's up to them. They can invest wisely with the money that they're given. But also have to take into account that this is not a company. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization in which, there is no shareholders. No one's getting dividends. The pastor doesn't make 5% of the tithes and offerings. It does not work like that. There's usually a board, an external board that sits there and dictates what the pastor is paid. And so I want to make sure that people factor that in, because that's just something I've kind of self-discovered, is there's no equity for these pastors that have spent, they started the church when they were 22 years old and now they're 64 years old, and they hand it off to the next pastor, and that's it. There's an applause, there's a little party, we've got some streamers around the office, but there's no golden watch. There's no, okay, man, you get, dividends that are coming in every year. There's no, I'm going to sell you 60% of the company so that you own it. I'm going to keep 40, and then hand that off to there's nothing like that. And so so I just want to show people that, when that pastor, that's very successful pastor, has chosen the career that he's chosen, it's also a very different long-term effect on his family. And I think that's one that's completely overlooked. Now, if you want to talk about pastors that, need a second plane, that's where we both can agree to disagree with them. But I do want people to take in mind and give what the Bible just talked about in talking about, giving the workman double the honor. I want to make sure that people are honoring their pastor, that they see the worth and the sacrifices. I met with a pastor recently, and he built his church from 80 people to 8,000, and then his church fired him because there was just different things, not a moral failure, just a leadership differences. Well, they were paying him very well at the end, and that was kind of one of the marks that they gave him. Like, look how much you're getting paid. And he said, one, I don't set my own pay. You did. The board did. Two, you're looking at what I've made the last 2 years, not what I've made the last 30 years. Because in the beginning, I'm bivocational. I'm substitute teaching while I'm doing this, while I'm building this church to 8,000 people. So you're almost back paying me for the years that my wife and I are eking by, where we both have 2 jobs just to make it happen. And so I also want people, when people look at a salary of a pastor, I want them to take a few steps back. This is not one of those positions where, it's always been like this. I want you to take into consideration how many decades they have been toiling. That's the proper word, toiling over this. And also the family sacrifices, and also just the long-term sacrifices that this family has made to be where they are.
Yeah, and so it's perhaps helpful for context to point out that of the pastors that you and I know, that's the majority. The majority of the pastors that we know are pastors that have had to live in trailer parks, that are deeply in debt, that have foreclosed on their homes, that I don't know a pastor with a Lamborghini. I don't know a pastor, with a nice BMW even. and that's not like that unreasonable, right? But yeah. I think that's important in that a lot of the heart behind where the discussion of keeping your pastor out of poverty and making sure they can just afford to take care of their family, that they can just afford to take care of their house comes from a lot of experience, I think, of watching these pastors who are so excited and so gung-ho and have such pure hearts into ministry. And I'm thinking of people in particular just as much as you're probably thinking of people in particular now that then have to feel the burnout, that then have to provide a lesser quality of ministry because their home life is suffering because, they have 3 kids and they wanted their wife to stay home, right? And so there's a part of it too where it's like you almost tell that kind of a pastor, hey, your wife needs to work and she might need to work 1 or 2 jobs. And also we expect you to be here 6 or 7 days a week and to be on call. 24/7. So if someone calls you at midnight, wanting to commit suicide, pastor, you got to answer this one.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And also for context for you and I, Sean, for the listener, is that I've had a job in the world where I've made many, many times over what I make now. And you've had a job prior to being a pastor where you made many, many times over. And so I want to make sure people understand the context of I'm not trying to get a raise. Don't need a raise. I'm good to go. I'm fine. What I'm saying is I'm talking to those people in those, that are kind of looking at pastors from the outside. Contextually, both you and I, when we were both pastors together, could have looked at our jobs and gone, we can make so much more out there doing what we used to do. And both of us had the option of doing what we used to do. I could go back on the road. I could pick up the phone right now and call my manager and go, just put it back together. I'm ready to make more money. And so I'm just saying, I want to make sure that people understand the context of what you and I are, how we're discussing this and why. And it sounds like I'm angry. I'm not angry. I'm very passionate because I want the church to be the best it possibly can be. I want these pastors not to have to look to the left or the right for incomes. Because listen, if you are so distraught on how much your pastor is making, then here's what I recommend you guys doing. Number one, you don't want to give your pastor more, then I challenge you to reduce his workload. Just like you're saying, it is almost a 7-day-a-week job. Why don't you go shadow your pastor or your creative director or your musical director at Easter or Christmas? Those are weeks of 80 to 90 hour weeks. Go shadow them for 3 weeks. You don't like how much you're paying him? Then tell him, listen, you only have to work Sunday to Wednesday. Take Thursday, Friday, and Saturday off. Okay? We'll reduce your pay, but you get 3 days off. So he gets quality of time, he gets quality of life, and you can feel better about not paying him. Also, don't be upset if you find out that your pastor has a side hustle. If he's doing real estate on the side, he's not duplistically minded. It's because you're not paying him enough that he can be focusing solely on the church. Then negotiate with him. Listen, please stop writing books, doing speaking engagements. Just stop all the things, be super hyper focused on just us, and we'll triple your salary. But if you're not willing to pony up to what a high level leader is, then or understand his worth, then you need to stop complaining. Going back to my analogy about the guy that had an 8,000 person church and they fired him because of leadership differences, that church right now is running a solid 800 people. I know sometimes you can't see what your pastor is worth because you're so in the weeds of it all. But when you've got a high level leader that is trouncing, that is a pioneer and if he went and started another business, he would crush it just because of his leadership skills. You got to overlook a lot of weeds and maybe fill in some gaps, get a better XP, plug in someone with a high EQ. You've got to work with him because there's a reason he took a congregation from 80 to 8,000, and there's a reason you're back down to 800. You got to figure that out. Work with your pastor. He's not your enemy. His salary is not your enemy. His divided time into these external. Paul was a tent maker. I don't see anybody yelling at Paul for being a tent maker. He was raising enough money. He had, he could have pocketed a few more dollars. Instead, he was just like, I don't want to be a burden. I'm going to get a side hustle. And so whatever your complaint about his time or his money is, go figure it out using practical sense and apply the real business world to the equation.
Well, yeah, and that's where the conversation in 1 Timothy chapter 5 comes. You referenced the 2 verses in there of someone who teaches God's word is worthy of double honor, and don't muzzle an ox, the worker is worthy of his wages, right? Paul also says in that, all of those things are true, lest we dishonor the gospel or disobey Christ, right? And so there's almost this emphasis where, if Paul didn't have to make tents, imagine how much more honor he could have done to planting churches across the known world, right? To spreading their gospel and the ministry. But to that point, it's probably a good time to pivot now to the upper end of this conversation, right?
Let's do it.
How much is too much for a pastor to make, right? And obviously, we can look at the extreme examples, the Joel Osteens, the Benny Hinns. We can look at pastors that, like you said, need a second private jet or need a fourth Lamborghini. And we have examples of that in culture. And that's wrong, and that feels wrong to those of us inside and outside of the church. I think any good, logically thinking Christian looks at those examples and says, okay, that's excess, right? And we can say that in our culture because we are in America, we're in a capitalist society, we're in a materialistic society. And so there's a point where tools and materials become status symbols and not tools, right?
Amen.
And so I'm not
Amen.
saying that a pastor can't have a nice car, but there's a difference between a Lamborghini and a Lexus, right? There's a big difference between, a Lexus and a 1987 Ford Pinto or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying a pastor should be driving a death trap, but it's at what point does a salary become more about a salary? Because so you give the example of an engineering company, right? If I were to go start my engineering company, I've got a couple dream cars I would probably buy if I was making whatever you said, 1.2 million or whatever. I'm not, by the way. But if I was, there are some things I would buy, and if I was making that salary as a pastor, buying those things would almost appear sinful. And I think that a large part of that is because of the way they can be viewed as a status symbol, and because a pastor is on a platform, and on this platform, it doesn't just say, like an engineering company would have, like Elon Musk, right? He has a platform which says, look at how I make green energy. I make it cool. I make it fun. I make it affordable. be like me in that regard. When a pastor has a platform, it says, look at how my relationship to God is.
That's right.
Right? Like Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. Well, that's the same thing a pastor says. And so I think why that feels so wrong then is because if we see pastors chasing after status symbols based on the society, the materialistic capitalist society that we live in, and I have nothing against capitalism, but I'm just saying we need to recognize that brings out materialism, that brings out things as status symbols, right? And if we see a pastor living his life chasing those things as well, that's going to leave the bitter taste in our mouths. And so that's why I made that initial statement of, I don't think it's a sin for pastors to want to make money. I think it's a sin for pastors to want to keep all of their money. And that just goes back to basic biblical principles about generosity, right? That goes back to the basic fundamental for handling money in the church, right? I'm thinking of the story of Jesus and his disciples sitting in the temple, and they look at this widow giving her last 2 mites. And just before that, Jesus was talking about the greed of the Pharisees. And as you know, throughout the Bible, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, the sin of Israel when they got carried off into Babylon, the sin of the Pharisees is taking advantage of widows and orphans and the poor, right? Those are chief complaints that God brings against his people when they start doing that. And so here's Jesus sitting in the temple with his disciples talking about how the Pharisees are taking advantage of the widows and the poor, and they're being dishonest when they sell the Passover lambs, right? And someone brings a lamb for context, and it has no blemishes, which is what it's supposed to for Passover, but the Pharisees can find one. And then they say, well, you can buy one from us from the temple for, an outrageous upcharge, right? And then Jesus says, look at that widow giving in her 2 mites. And it's typically taught in churches like, oh, good for her. Like generosity should hurt, right? That's not the point of the Bible or in context at all. The point is Jesus is saying, look at these Pharisees taking advantage of this widow and taking her last 2 mites. They should be taking care of this widow, not taking advantage of her, right? And so I think then pastors, especially pastors who make large incomes, the sin isn't making the large income, and it's not wanting to make a large income for all the reasons we just talked about. The sin is not wanting to fulfill the call of ministry. And I know I'm probably touching on something very near and dear to your heart, as our previous conversation definitely had a lot to do with altruism. So I will give you the floor on this topic now.
No, we could not agree more. I mean, to me, the Bible says very clear about, Paul said, I become all things to all men so I can win some. Well, Lamborghini is going to put you apart and separate you from the majority of those around you. And so therefore, I'm not going to lie to you. I love making money. I don't love money. I enjoy it as a game. I love investing. I love real estate. I love startups. I feel like at heart, I'm a venture capitalist in a lot of ways. I do enjoy the game of money, but as a pastor and as a Christian, that's not my calling. I'm not here to pursue financial gain. I'm not here to make money or the appearance of making money. I drive a truck. I do things in my life that, I want to make sure that like I can reach anybody and everybody and nothing stands in my way. For instance, you won't catch me like at a bar. I will not be there with even a cup, because I'm very nervous that like an ex-alcoholic is going to walk in and be like, that's my pastor. And even if it's water, in my cup, somebody could walk in and be like, that's my pastor, I'm out, forget it. Or, I never, you and I have talked about this many times, way back in the day, about living above reproach, even with women. You will not catch me in an elevator alone with a woman. Like the person that I'm closest to at work, she's my right-hand woman, Sophia Marshall, you know her. But her and I yesterday were working alone together, and we sat our desk in front of the giant glass so anybody could walk by and open up the door or see in. We're not going to be behind, anywhere that no one could find. I just want to make sure that our hands are up. We're just absolutely living an approach, and I'm living above reproach. I don't ride in cars with other women. And this is all, even before I was a pastor, this is even when I was in Amberlin, because I knew one accusation could level my band. And now I know one accusation could level my ministry. And in the same way, it's with money. We have a nice house. It's very comfortable. Like it's a comfortable little house. My kids have to sleep in the same room. No big deal. Like, I want to teach them how to share, but we're not living over and above, and we're not, it's just not like that. And so I want to become all things to all men, that I might win some.
Yeah, definitely. And you bring up a good point, because I think the question that comes with, well, how do you live above reproach? How do you hold to the standard of not, and the heart from it comes behind, do not do anything to make your brother stumble, the Bible says. I don't know the verse reference off the top of my head, so this is why I'm not a pastor anymore. But that's the heart, right? Is to not do anything to make anyone stumble. And then you talked about two examples that aren't money, which is alcohol and being alone with the opposite sex. And it's like, well, how do you do that? Well, you need accountability, number one, right? And then number two, you need discipline, or maybe those would actually be flipped. You probably need discipline before accountability, because if you're not disciplined, you're not going to be accountable. But either way, two of the top things that come to mind of what you need to do that is discipline and accountability. And so it's like, why would we treat money any differently in the church? Right? Why would we not be open with what we make, especially if you're on a church with multiple pastors like you and I have found ourselves on? And it's interesting, because there often tends to be a large gap between the associate or assistant pastors and the senior pastor or executive pastors, or vice versa, right? And then with that gap, there comes this culture of unaccountability, right? And so I think that's how it can get out of hand very, very quickly, to a pastor buying a Lamborghini, to a pastor buying a second jet, to a pastor buying the mansion in the country club. But yeah, I think then, as a pastor, and I'm trying to think of how to relate this to someone in a congregation who is questioning a pastor's salary, but as a pastor, you need to have that accountability, right? And then as a member in a congregation, you can be aware of a church board. A church can be open about its finances. And so if this is a major issue, this is always something you can ask about as a congregant, if that makes sense.
I agree. I do think that the finances need to be pretty wide open, and I don't think that the exact number of the salary of each pastor should be,
sure, yeah,
put out there. I don't think that, because you're never going to make everyone happy. You just aren't. I would go into a riot if I knew a pastor on my staff was paid, minimal. That would just, and so I'm upset, and then you have somebody else who's upset, thinking that's too much. But there's just so many ways we can go with this. But I think that at the end of the day, I think that God is going to judge each and every one of us, when we get to heaven. And I think the pastor's got to know his own heart. I do think that, like, he knows the scriptures. He knows that there might be blood on his hands, and he's going to have to stand through God and give an account of his entire life and existence. And since he's chosen the path of becoming a pastor, he's going to be accountable for every single cent that he made. And so I think the best thing to do would be find an independent board, outside of the church. Our church, I love how Grace has it structured. They are not yes men to Pastor Craig, but what they are is they're business leaders in the community, along with some ministers from other churches. So that way you get a roundabout as far as, like, how much should he be paid? How much, what are the benefits that we're going to give him? What are the healthcare benefits that we're going to give him? That way it's not him saying, this is what I'm going to make, and I'm going to tell you, and this year, it's not like that. It's a third party that's able to speak and keep our pastor accountable.
Yeah, I mean, you said a pastor might have blood on his hands on Judgment Day. No, a pastor will have blood on his hands on Judgment Day, right? Because a pastor is just a human sinner like the rest of us.
Amen. Amen. Yep.
The hope is that the blood on the pastor's hands is covered by the blood of the cross on the Judgment Day. You always want your pastors to be saved. It's typically
That's usually a good thing. That's usually a good thing. Yep. Yeah.
It's typically an entrance requirement. But to that point too, yes, I agree with, we shouldn't go around exposing every pastor's salary. And part of that is because if you do that, you're going to have to expose every pastor's level of generosity. And that's just not how it should be, right? I mean, we're kind of used to it in our culture with celebrities, right? If I don't know, Robert Downey Jr., someone writes a humongous check to build a hospital somewhere, it's like, oh, that's awesome. We love to see our celebrities being generous. We love to know the dollar amount, because it's usually this like astronomical, like tens of millions of dollars. And it was like chump change for them, right? Like it didn't hurt them at all. But it's this astronomical figure that most of us will never even see in our life, right? And they're just giving it away to build a hospital or to some charity. And so we love to see that, but we can't expect the same out of pastors. And so there's that aspect, but then there's also the Bible says, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, right? And if pastors started being generous for the show of generosity, which is what it would have to turn into if we start revealing pastor salaries, if they started being generous for the show, then you could make an argument that that's not true biblical generosity. And you wouldn't have to make that argument very tough, because even those not in the church would see, oh, okay, this is just a show. They're probably not even truly generous. They're just doing this just like celebrities do it, right? And I'm not saying celebrities aren't truly generous, but it's easy to be cynical when we watch a celebrity, give tens of millions of dollars away to something and say, oh, well, they're just doing that for the tax benefit, or they're just doing that so everyone loves them and they can get the next movie role that they want, or whatever it is. So I think that point is worth mentioning as well.
1 Corinthians 9:9-14 says this real fast. I think it kind of ties in. It says, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Paul goes on to say, nevertheless, I haven't done that. I have not made use of this right. But what closes it with the saying, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And so I really think that a healthy living wage, and like you said, taking into external factors, but also taking into how good of a leader, how far have they brought the church, needs to be put into consideration. And I think an external board, in my opinion, who is looking out for not only the pastor, but also the church, should have a say in it. So I think we just solved the world's problems, Sean. Congratulations. Next week, poverty. I think we can solve the entire global poverty in one podcast. It's going to be great.
I was going to say politics. Let's solve politics.
Okay, that's going to take two episodes. That's going to take 2 episodes. And actually deals with poverty, so we're going to be good.
That's true. Yeah, I agree. As you continue in your pastoral ministry, Stephen, don't go buy 2 private jets. That's probably the advice I would give you. And 7 Lamborghinis.
Too late. Shoot. Gotta take a few things back. I kept the receipts.
Yeah, there you go. But you mentioned it previously. And so I think I want to close probably on this note of recognizing the fact that you and I stepped into ministry in a very privileged position, and recognizing that privilege. And I'm not just using it because it's a cultural buzzword at the moment. But it truly is, in that you mentioned at any point, you and I could have stepped out of ministry and made more money, And so to kind of wrap it all up, the heart of ministry is never one that enters into it for the money, like you would other professions, And I would also make the case, if you enter medicine for money, or you enter engineering, or you want to be a lawyer or a rock star for money, you're probably not going to go very far anyway, because you have to, and we understand this when it comes to the secular jobs, right? We understand this when it comes to medicine. We understand this when it comes to being a rock star, when it comes to being a lawyer, an engineer, whatever. It's like, you have to love the work you do. You have to follow your passion. And I think that there is probably a deeper level to that in pastoral ministry, because you not only have to love the work you do, which isn't always a pulpit. It's a pulpit like a very small fraction of the time. It's counseling. It's, like you said, leading, and not just leading from a stage, but leading on one-to-one, face-to-face conversations with staff, with congregation. It's a broken heart, and you have to love having a broken heart for the Lord. And so there's the kind of deeper part of it, is like, you really got to love God. You really got to follow a call that God puts on your life, despite any obstacles, and money most often being one of those obstacles that come up, and so I think that has a lot to do with the heart behind it too, of a good pastor doesn't go into ministry for a salary.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have nothing to add. I totally agree. I mean, anything that go into what you're passionate about and then find a way to make money at it, but no, I don't, again, even now in today's music, when young musicians come and talk to me, I just tell them, like, listen, if you think and expect there to be money at the end of this, you're wrong. The majority of bands, 1% of bands sell over 1,000 records. And so, just understand that you may not make money at this, but go be passionate, buy that guitar, go start the band. And in the same way, I would just tell a young minister, like, if you're going to get this in this for money, like, honestly, there are so many better jobs as far as financially secure and sound. Go do that. But if you're called to this, I've said this to you personally, Sean, I just can't take my hands off this plow. I get so much out of it, and it's not monetary. I am so excited about life right now, developing. I feel like I'm being an entrepreneur. I'm being used by God. I love my stage in life right this second. I just want to push pause. It's my favorite year of ministry of all time. And there's not a price that could be paid to get me out of it. I am very content right where I'm at, financially, physically, emotionally, and definitely spiritually. I'm called to this moment.
That is fantastic to hear. Well, Stephen, I think we've exhausted the subject for this episode. Thank you so much for being on The Christian Skeptic again. For anyone listening, if you would like Stephen to return a third time, let me know. That could possibly be arranged.
There you go. I appreciate it, Sean. And always a pleasure, man. And thank you for touching on this subject. I have never heard a podcast touch on this. I've heard grumblings and complainings, but never any type of problem solving or logic deemed into this conversation. So I appreciate it.
Well, who knows? Maybe someone will listen and grumble and complain about what we talked about. And I'll get some emails in. You might get some emails in at your church. And
that's fine.
But I encourage that. So as always, let me know. Feel free to write into the show. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.